And I said, I can describe Bloomington.
I remember you organized, was it like a TikTok panel?
Yeah.
I can't believe that we're already now in week 5 of the Cloak series, coming off of Brian's great talk last week. We have Brigham Daniels coming up this coming week, which is going to be great. I believe, Angie, if I'm not mistaken, are you moderating today for us?
I am.
Excellent. Well, let me turn things over to you properly, and Angie will in turn properly introduce our distinguished speaker, Sarah Danzman. So thanks everyone for joining us.
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to welcome today Professor Danzman from IU. I want to put a little context into this. Active Ostrom person, we're incredibly happy to read this paper, and I, for one, am very interested in this paper. I thought several of the points you made were something that I assumed would be true, and so when I got to them and they were actually more robust or more part of the data set that you had gathered, I was really excited about it. So I had told her already that I was not going to take a tremendous amount of time because we keep running out of time in these. So I'm going to turn it over to her. I do want people to know that she has graciously agreed to stay on until 1:30. And I will absolutely be the evil beekeeper of the Zoom meeting. When someone gives you a cutoff, I try really hard to keep that honest and true. I will be keeping the chat and we'll be paying attention to raised hands as well to help you so you can do this. I know it's hard with the shared screen, but otherwise I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for being here again.
Well, thank you so much, Angie. I'm so thrilled to be here today to present what is very early work, which I also really appreciate people being willing to read such early work. One of the things that's been really challenging, I think for many people, and certainly for me during the pandemic, is to kind of recalibrate how much can get done. But one of the really nice things about presenting early work is that I can really incorporate your suggestions, even to the level of data collection, because we're still playing around with some issues that we're experiencing with data collection. So I really, really thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules. Our schedules have gotten only busier since the pandemic to be part of this community with me today. So I'm presenting today some very early work with that I'm co-authoring with Sophie Meunier, who's at Princeton. And I also would be remiss if I didn't point out that I have 3 really excellent undergraduate research assistants who have been working with me on this project. They are all, well, 2 of them are HLS students and one of them is in Kelly. The Kelly student is Julia Brunner. I also have been working with Britt Rogers and Catherine Heidger. A quick plug for those of you who do work related to development, that every semester the Tobias Center at HLS does issue a call for funding undergraduate RAs, and I really recommend that you submit a proposal next time that you see that go out, because one of the things that's been really wonderful about this project and a couple of others that I've been working on is working with undergraduates who are really engaged and excellent. So I want to spend some time just putting the research in context. So when we think about the nexus of national security and foreign investment, we probably think about things like, it's probably not a great idea to have foreign investors that might have kind of ties to adversarial governments to control major parts of your critical infrastructure, like maybe your ports right around big cities, right? And maybe you might go so far to say, hey, let's also make sure that we keep an eye out on who owns kind of major companies that are involved in the development and production of key technologies that undergird our entire system, our entire economy, like advanced semiconductors and so forth, right? So apologies, because I do see that we have a couple of people on the call that might might take a little bit, this might be a little bit aggressive here, but we probably wouldn't think, when we think about national security and foreign investment, we probably wouldn't think that a major grocery store chain is, a national security concern, to make sure that it stays nationally or owned by investors that are national investors, right? And we probably wouldn't think about investors that own similar companies in countries that also speak the same language as you to be, major concerns from a national security perspective. But this example of Carrefour is just another recent example of ways in which governments in developed countries have recently become much more concerned and about the national security implications of foreign investment and willing to act to prevent those kinds of deals from going through. So recently, the French blocked, my apologies if my pronunciation is a little bit off, but Couche-Tard, which is a Canadian but Montreal-based company, from acquiring Carrefour, which is a major grocery store retail chain in France, indicating that there are core national security concerns associated with this particular transaction. Interestingly, the Quebec economy minister, when he was kind of trying to negotiate toward this deal going through, specifically pointed out that a French company had in the past acquired a Bauerle, which was Montreal-based, and that was an investment that over time worked to benefit both the economies of both countries. So clearly drawing on some reciprocity-oriented actions, but that didn't matter. The French went ahead and blocked the transaction. And this specific example relates to a broader issue that we are seeing when it comes to developed countries, and their stance towards investment screening. So over here, I show from 2010 to 2020, basically all of the measures that UNCTAD's investment policy monitor has found that relate to investment screening measures across OECD countries over the time period. These investment approval and screening measures are basically anything that relates to the screening and approval of foreign investment. So it has to be something that is specific to foreign investment rather than just a broader screening that could also affect domestic firms. And most of these measures are ones that have to do with things like scoping screening to specific sectors or business activities, to amending ownership and monetary thresholds for review, and so forth. And over this time period, we also saw that 5 countries in the OECD created new investment screening mechanisms for the first time. One of the things I really want to point out here is that 2020 sees this huge jump, right? But if we look back at the data, we see that this huge jump in 2020 kind of was preceded by a pretty big change, kind of starting around 2017, where before we didn't have very many measures passed each year, and they were really a mix between restrictive, neutral, or liberalizing. But then starting in 2017, we start to see this more restrictive kind of approach, such that by 2018, there have been no more liberalizing measures forwarded when it comes to screening. So we're really interested in this question in understanding, first of all, understanding the landscape of investment screening mechanisms across these countries, and then asking and answering several questions that relate to kind of major kind of theoretical questions in IPE. So when we think about investment screening in IPE theory, we don't have a lot of very good answers for what might be driving this, and especially driving this in the set of countries that we're looking at. So first, we know that from my own work, here's a picture of my book, that domestic business groups support openness to in order to overcome financing constraints. And this is especially the case for mergers and acquisitions. And so the idea that you're going to put up all of these screening mechanisms that are going to make it challenging to allow these M&As to go forward is a bit surprising from that perspective. Additionally, the promises as well as the threats of reciprocity can really drive public opinion on investment policy. So we have evidence that when publics believe that other countries are also opening up their markets to investment, you have more public support for liberalized investment or liberalized investment measures as well, and that you really only get kind of that when you have countries that are, you know, really restrictive, then that's where you get kind of sentiments against foreign investment. We also know that governments are more likely to embrace FDI during economic downturns for the stimulative effects of investment, and also for employment support. A lot of the research on this focuses on developing countries, but it also seems, you know, not that much of a leap to say that, you know, that when countries are going through, even developed countries are going through economic crises, you know, there are reasons to be worried about putting in more restrictions on investment coming in, because that can make it harder to recover from economic recession. There's also research that suggests that screening may be a way to further liberalize. So the idea is you create this big, or if you have screening, right, for national security reasons, then that allows you to open up even more and more sectors. But as we saw in the previous example, there are at least some cases in which governments are really using these screening mechanisms in ways that suggest that they are expanding their view of what counts as a national security issue that needs to be protected against. And that also suggests that screening is a really interesting example of regulatory proliferation, where the design features that are embedded in these screening mechanisms, and the screening mechanisms can really vary quite a bit, reflect very complex domestic and international preferences, and that these ways that these screening mechanisms are structured can really affect outcomes. They can affect how much the screening mechanism creates real barriers to investment beyond what we might think of as real national security concerns. And they can also affect how investment flows into certain sectors over time. And kind of at a more fundamental level, screening we can think of as perhaps a site of contention for what we mean when we say national security, right? And this gets to the heart of a lot of research and a lot of theorizing being done right now about this concept of weaponized interdependence, and kind of how open do we want to be? How much does globalization create all sorts of vulnerabilities that we need to protect ourselves against? And again, this Carrefour example is a really good example of how we need to have better understanding of these investment screening mechanisms to help us update our IP theory, because a lot of this theory is not quite sufficient enough to explain what's going on right now. Okay, so in the paper, we attempt to do three things. The first is we start from the premise that we really just need better descriptive data across time. In order to explain what's going on here, we need to understand what's going on first. So we're looking at the period of about 2008 until today. And the reason why we picked 2008 is because we think that's an important inflection point with the global financial crisis and moving forward until today. And we're really interested in seven areas. We're interested in the scope, what types of investments are actually covered, the thresholds, how much investment needs to occur in order for screening to occur. We're interested in how screening mechanisms treat foreign government control, and if there are kind of enhanced screening mechanisms when there is foreign government control in a transaction. We're interested in how investment screening mechanisms might not just be about national security, but about other things as well. So some countries have net benefit tests as well integrated into these screening mechanisms where you have to show a positive economic benefit in order for the transaction to be approved. We're interested in pre-approval requirements. So is it a requirement that the transaction actually be approved before investment can go forward? What sort of enforcement is there of these screening rules? So that means, are there actual fines, and are those fines big enough that they actually change behavior? And finally, what sort of screening apparatus do you have? And we're particularly interested in if there is a whole of government approach where there's an interagency that kind of determines together if there's a national security concern that needs to be dealt with, or if a lot of that authority rests within a particular ministry and therefore can perhaps be a little bit more captured. So the first thing we're doing is and I can talk, while I did not get to the point in the data where we can kind of show you pretty clean graphs, I can talk through what is happening in each of these areas, because we have done enough of this coding that we are very confident that we know what the trends look like and what the variation looks like. So the second part is that we're trying to connect investment screening proliferation to COVID, and especially to explain how investment screening politics is more than COVID. I really want to talk more about what you all think about this in Q&A, because we were planning to write this paper before COVID, and now because of COVID, we feel like we have to address COVID, because there's this sense that so much of what's happening in investment screening is due to COVID, and we think that COVID is important, but it's not really, it's not the underlying issue at play here. So that's another thing that we're doing here, is to try to kind of say, yes, COVID matters, but it doesn't matter in the ways that, you know, some are trying to say it does. And then finally, we want to lay out an agenda for future research, because we don't think we can do all of these things and start in on hypothesis testing. So that is where we are with this paper, and hopefully that gives you a better sense of what it is we're trying to do. In particular, you know, I wrote in a little chapeau some kind of this is the type of stuff that we're really interested in getting feedback on. The argument space, kind of should we even be talking about COVID? Is the type of kind of process tracing kind of that we are doing in here at all useful, or should we focus on a few key cases? And then also, especially since we're early on, we can incorporate some ideas that people might have in terms of measurement choices. And so, you know, of course, if you have other thoughts, we'd love to hear those as well. But these are kind of the spaces that we are really kind of focused on right now in terms of where we think we need to go in order to strengthen and move toward a version of this that can be sent out for review. So thank you all. I look forward to your questions and comments and thoughts on this.
So I have an open queue, and I'm always happy to jump in first if, oh, I see Tim, are you okay unmuting and asking?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Really interesting, Sarah. So I had a general comment, and I was curious about. It's a really interesting project. I don't have a whole lot of scintillating comments, but on the issue of COVID, my reaction is I wouldn't write the paper around COVID, because right now, I think you either need to change your research question, make it more direct about what is the effect of COVID on this, which is an interesting question that could be part of the outputs. But right now the research question is bigger, and I think it's an appropriate research question you're asking is, look at what's going on, what explains this, right? And then the way it's written right now, you come and you say, well, in this paper, we're going to argue that this happened. The COVID was not the cause of this. This COVID is an exacerbation of a pre-existing trend, but that still doesn't answer your research question, which what explains it, right? And this is sort of and I guess if you want, my thought is that I think it'll be a bigger contribution to the literature if you can sort of frame it more broadly, and maybe just my suggestion. I think other people could think otherwise, and you could be real about COVID. But I think COVID strengthens the interesting, what makes this interesting, but it maybe isn't the initial rationale for it. And so then I was really curious about about your explanations you're developing. I especially like the globalization backlash and rise of economic patriotism, and maybe the decline of IOs and the decline of the neoliberal international economic order. And I was just curious. To me, a challenge is going to be in terms of dealing with the IPE community is how you can convince, if you want to pursue that, right? And if you think that's an interesting argument, how would you create a research design where you could test that, right? I mean, you could look at the political parties in charge, you could look at the governments, you could try to do some things with public opinion, but then I would suggest thinking about setting up the paper as, Carrefour is interesting because it's a very prominent supermarket chain that everybody can relate to, right? But so you would have different expectations for how the French would react to that than it would maybe a smaller, less well-known, less prominent firm that would have less people, less sort of stakeholders in it. So you can set up some interesting. If I'm right, then we should see more pandering towards public. We should see this happening in more of these prominent sort of public opinion areas that people that might tie into sort of this neoliberal backlash kind of aspect. I just saying that anytime you work with sort of public opinion arguments, because I've thought about some of my own work, is that the pushback is always like, do you really think people would relate to this? Is this something that really is that salient in the minds of the public and of the leaders in the grand scheme of all these other pressures? But anyway, so I think that's really interesting. I like all your arguments here. I think the interesting place where you can really be creative and have to work hard a little bit too is trying to think about how to operationalize what you have as 1, 2, and 3 in terms of explanations into actual data that you could kind of compare against this great data set you're building. So not a whole lot of questions, but just some thoughts.
Tim, that's super helpful. Oh, Angie, are we doing this where I respond right away, or do we collect?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure, you can go ahead.
So, that's super helpful, and it's also helpful to know that this is something that people think is interesting and important, because as someone who has studied FDI policy for quite a while now, when I first started this kind of broader project in my dissertation period, people were always telling me that this was a boring topic because everyone loves FDI and there's no politics here anymore. And I vehemently said, you all are wrong. So I'm glad that, if you persist for long enough, you can just wait until the political tides change a little bit. So I think kind of some of what I'm hearing here is that, we really need to focus a lot more on operationalization. And I agree. And one of the things that's been a little bit hard for me on this project is that I feel like it's quite a bit, it's more kind of inductive and theory building in a way that kind of I'm not trained as a researcher to do. And so I'm finding that I'm kind of a little bit out on a limb here. And so I'm trying to negotiate that. the other thing that I'd say is that, you know, in terms of economic backlash and decline of IOs, Sophie, my co-author, is a scholar of the EU. And one of the things that's very interesting about this case is that the EU has really driven a lot of what's happened in Europe, because the EU issued a new directive that every country needs to have, like, at least, like, not every country needs to have a screening mechanism, but if they do, it needs to adhere to certain guidelines. And at the minimum, everyone needs to kind of share data with each other. And so, especially because that was already set up and the EU had already kind of taken that position and passed that ruling, then through COVID, they were able to sort of be like, no, now, like, you all really should, like, we can't require you to have a screening mechanism, but you really should, and you should really do it in this way. So one of the things that we're seeing is that though there's quite a bit of proliferation of different types of like screening rules, in Europe, we're getting much more cohesion in terms of the new rules, and the amendments are starting to mimic each other in some interesting ways. So it's complicated because IOs it could be a decline of IOs at the multinational level, but at the regional level, they're also driving some of this. And so my interest, so Sophie's really interested in that kind of EU politics, and I'm really interested in the like what's happening in terms of elite lobbying and interest groups around this, because to me it's very odd that firms are going along with this. And so for me, like, the economic backlash stuff is kind of interesting, but I'm really more interested in the firms themselves and why are they not blocking these sorts of new rules. And it might be tied to economic backlash because it might be harder for them to kind of make their point in an era in which people are kind of primed against globalization. But one of the big challenges that we're having around operationalization is so much of this happens in the shadows. So we can get some very high profile examples because they're reported in the news as blocks, but most of what happens in terms of investment screening is secret. And we can't get that. We can't get that kind of like data about like what transactions are actually screened, and then which ones are blocked and which ones are allowed forward. But thank you. I'm gonna really continue to ask you questions as we start to work on operationalization more.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll jump in for one comment. I agree with the COVID. I think it'd be much more interesting to wait another 18 months and ask why COVID is different, because it seems like that's where your research is leading. But hopefully that didn't just completely gut Jess's comment, because she's next.
No, Tim did that, so don't worry, Angie. No, so Sarah, it's like obvious even from just the two comments you've already gotten, like how fertile this paper is in terms of like different ideas that come of it. And so my inclination is to agree with Angie and Tim on the COVID point, except that you have this long discussion about crisis politics. And so the question to me is, like, you could go one of two directions, as I see it. One is to explain this general trend, and then COVID is kind of a very large blip in the data that you address, right? Alternatively, you really take this as a like discussion of crisis politics, right? That where you sort of take the approach of the largest variation, it requires the largest explanation, right? And so that's where you're going to focus. And I think that's feasible, but then you really need to, dig into what you start to talk about in terms of all the theories related to crisis politics, and COVID is just the relevant case at hand. So that in some ways depends on like, where you see this research agenda going. I think they could both be interesting. And some of it might in fact also hinge on what the data are actually saying. And I know that this is super early, and so there's only so much that you could show us. But one question I was interested in is you had this really cool graph, right? And it looked like the highest number was like 28 or 30 instances of screening mechanisms. right? And so I'm really curious about like to what extent those are distributed across countries, right? So like you have like which ones discover, or, have their first like investment mechanisms, right? We list those, but I'm curious like how well those are distributed across country, like whether some countries perceive this as a really useful new tool and sort of or disaggregated across sectors, and therefore each one counts like counts towards this total. So I'm a little curious about that coding and the distribution. More broadly, you seem to want to say something about national security as a justification. And you also point to the fact that this is super nebulous and that like there's all this conversation about what that could actually mean. But I also get the sense that there's something in your data that can tell us something about that. So I'm not clear how you want to define, how you, like, Sarah Bauerle Danzman want to define national security. Whether it's actually coded, you seem to suggest in your paper that it's coded in your data, but I'm not sure what that looks like or what that would look like really. So I would love to hear more about that. So that we can have a sense as to whether the direction is really about sort of like, we're unpacking this area of justification for screening that hasn't really been discussed because it's been isolated and essentially, bracketed out. But there's also some really potentially interesting theoretical frames about why and how and when countries use national security as a justification for these mechanisms or these sort of new mechanisms. That was a lot. I'm going to be quiet now. But clearly there's like so much here, right? And there's so many different ways to go. And I just have lots of questions. So I'll just leave it there.
Thanks, Jess. Super helpful comments. And yeah, part of the issue here is that, I mean, I'm biased, but I think that this area is so fruitful for so much research. So it's hard to even begin to kind of be like, well, which way do I want to take this? Because there isn't very much that has been written yet. In terms of national security and what it is, yeah, you're right that there's definitely like, I'm very interested in this kind of question of like, how do we determine what gets to count as national security and not? And part of that is because one of the concerns with investment screening is that it can just be a way to be protectionist, right? So there's this sense that, I mean, this is very similar to the arguments happening in the trade sphere, right? That, when you kind of invoke a national security exception, and then no one can kind of, then like it's non-judiciable, so you can't go and kind of determine, is this actually a national security threat or not? Then that means that national security can be used, for very protectionist means that have nothing to really, that don't really have much to do with national security. And there are a lot of people making that argument about TikTok in the United States. I would say that TikTok does represent a real national security risk, but that the way that the Trump administration went about dealing with it was not great and led to a lot of pushback. But that's my interpretation of what's going on. But reasonable people really can disagree about this. And so the national security kind of component here really matters, because that's where a lot of the politics, yeah, 5G, yeah, that's where a lot of the politics, where a lot of the politics are here. In terms of national security kind of frameworks, one of the things that we are collecting is different countries have different what are called like essential security concepts. And so in the United States, it's national security. In a lot of European countries, the kind of law around this is related to public security and public order. Sophie has told me that the reason for this distinction is because in the EU, like the EU doesn't have authority over security. And so it has to be kind of framed in terms, doesn't have authority over national security. And so the public security and public order frameworks fit better in terms of what the EU has competence over. I'm not like, so, you know, I take Sophie, she's the expert on that. My sense is that when you invoke concepts of public order, that becomes a more encompassing framework than national security itself. So one of the things is to kind of see how those different essential security concepts kind of play out in terms of what gets scoped in and what doesn't. But again, one of the things that's challenging is that when you get to like getting the laws is something that we can get. Like right now, while I showed you the UNCTAD kind of information, most of what we're coding from for the actual data set comes from the OECD, because the OECD has a lot of data available online about their member countries, and they have like a whole document on national security screening, but then they also have transparency requirements that require members to provide information when they change a law that has that influences their laws around foreign investment. What is hard to get are the actual data on the actual like transactions, right? So if we really want to see, well, what does this do in terms of like these different security concepts with respect to like, what does that mean for actual transactions? We're not going to get a list of here are all of the transactions that were reviewed, and here are the ones that were kind of were allowed through, here are the ones that were blocked, and here are the ones that were allowed, but with like different levels of mitigation, which is also something that governments can do. They can say, we're going to allow this investment to go through, but we're going to condition this approval on a set of mitigation kind of requirements that can be quite kind of complex, but we can't get all of those data. So that limits what we're going to be able to do with respect to that. So we have to find clever ways of dealing with it. And then in terms of distribution,
say this like this is related to this. There's nothing in the actual like mechanisms that say this is related to national security in some way, shape, or form, and this is not, right? You can't get that, or is that you're just going to be sort of your interpretation? Your interpretation.
Well, no, we can. So for instance, our data set, we kind of went back and forth. Originally, I thought that we should only be collecting data on screening mechanisms that were very explicitly for national security reasons. But then Sophie was like, no, we really need all of the investment screening mechanisms, whether they are for national security or not, and then indicate what you can block a transaction for. So for instance, Mexico in our database does have it's in our database as having a screening mechanism. The screening mechanism, we need to kind of investigate a little bit more, because they have a screening mechanism that is not really tied to national security. It's just a screening mechanism. But there are a lot of investors from the US are exempted from it, as are a lot of investors from a lot of other Latin American countries. And it's unclear how much it's actually used. So that's another thing, is that you can have these laws on the books, but they might not actually be used. So the Canada has had an investment screening mechanism since 1985, but for the first maybe 10, maybe 15 years of it, it wasn't used all that much, and it's being used a lot more now. So there are these other issues in terms of, we want to go beyond just the de jure kind of laws to how much are these things actually being invoked as well. So that's why it's gotten much more complicated than we had originally thought when we started the data coding process.
Brian?
Good. Interesting stuff, and apologies that I wasn't able to read the paper, but looks like you've got a lot of neat data and such to work on. I've got two things that are mainly comments, but would be quite interested in responses you may have now on both of them. One, in terms of the kind of larger research project, for me, it would be quite interesting, and I think it's something hopefully you actually are thinking about and it's not coming through, the kind of both motivation and the normative part of this. You said you care about this vehemently. What makes this so important to you? What values do you have that are motivating this research? And part of this comes back to me trying to understand Lynn Ostrom, and just to do the capsule version, why did she end up riding around in the back of police cars? She cared about self-governance. She cared about little cities, bigger is better. They were going to be gobbled up, and that was maybe worse for people. So then she ended up in very detailed stuff. She kept very clear, and I see this more as I go back and read things about her own values, while at the same time presenting things in ways that were quite accessible to more mainstream readers and, kind of positive approaches and so on. So for me, that's part of what could make a big, would make this stronger and more interesting. I can speculate, are you concerned, how do we keep the gains of trade while we cope with disruptive technologies and a rising power? But, what actually the big questions for you may actually be different. So that's one point. The second one is more specifically in terms of policy change. And, there's probably lots of literature I'm not so aware of, but certainly the kind of thing that would be relevant for me is this, big question of what makes policy change, in particular, what you seem to have some stuff for this kind of, okay, there's some things on the shelf or it's starting to happen, and then they get taken off the shelf or accelerated is what you talk about. I know there are ideas of punctuated equilibrium, episodic change. And so whether the detailed analysis you have speaks to those kind of models of policy change or other models, and again, how it speaks, whether it fits some larger patterns or doesn't fit, and you have some ideas about why it doesn't fit. But to me, both the, big questions of, why do you care about this? Why does this matter? And does this give us some insights on how major policy changes happen? Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Those are really great questions. So real quickly, in terms of motivation and normative concerns here, I think I would say that for me, what I worry about is when we connect, as we broaden our conceptions of national security, part of that is because there really are kind of conceptual issues that we're working through as we've shifted into an information economy, that the boundaries between commercial use and military use have really blurred. What is considered dual use has really expanded. And there are real concerns about, as well, kind of a set of kind of institutions and expectations about how the global economy works, and how the laws around international exchange works, that were sort of predicated on the idea that the actors involved in exchange would mostly be private actors, and to the extent that there were public actors involved, it would be clear that they were public actors. And now we also have situations in which there is government control or a large amount of influence over firms, but it's not always the case that that influence or control is transparent, right? And so we just have a set of institutions that were created in a time period that looks quite different from kind of what our current system looks like. And so for me, there's this kind of dual issue of, do our institutions sort of match the types of kind of interactions that we're facing? But also, I worry that kind of further securitizing international exchange just creates really zero-sum frameworks of thinking about things in ways that can really break down not just economic prosperity, but also opportunities for governments to find positive ways to interact with each other. And to the extent that the largest problem of our time is climate change, and we need to work together to solve it. I think that a world in which we're all focused on how everyone's out to get each other is probably not conducive to solving that. In terms of policy change, yes, I think that, you know, what my mental model here is that most of the policy change is happening at the elite level. I don't think that publics are really involved in this very much. And so the question for me is why are domestic like firms going to agree to or not going to, or either going to agree to or fail to stop kind of these policy changes that make their interactions harder, right? Because especially when we talk about M&A, when you have this cross-border M&A, and now we're talking about situations in which in order to do a merger or an acquisition, you need to get approval from multiple jurisdictions in order to get it done. Like, it just becomes really hard, right? So other than the lawyers involved in this, who wants this in the business community? And how do we need to kind of change our way of thinking about how this policy change occurs if it's the case that firms are not getting as much of what they want in this arrangement right now?
Okay, if I can do a quick follow-up, just again, COVID is clearly a big shock. To the extent I peeked at something in the paper, you seem to be making an argument that this is actually not a critical juncture, which could potentially be something surprising, counterintuitive to say. You know, why do you think it's not actually, you know, part of a regime shift? And, you know, what would be a critical juncture, or how would the regime shift change? So
yeah, so I think that Sophie and I would both say that a lot of that most of the time what happens with governments in terms of when they decide that they need a screening mechanism is because they had a specific transaction that they really didn't like, and they didn't have a legal authority to do anything over it. So this is sort of, you know, in the US case, we get a big change in our investment screening mechanism law after the Dubai Ports World scandal back in 2016, or I'm sorry, 2006, right? And then we get some more kind of, kind of smaller but important kind of patterns of investment in high tech from Chinese connected firms in the early 2010s that led to a new arrangement within the US government with the passage of FIRMA in 2018. In Germany, it was things like Axitron and KUKA, which were both kind of very concerning transactions for different reasons in Germany. And down the line, we see this. And so I think that that's what's driving kind of an interest in creating legal structures that can allow governments to stop transactions that they're really concerned about. And for us, what we think kind of COVID is doing is it's temporarily preventing business groups from being able to mount effective counter lobbying to these sorts of laws being passed. And that's why we're getting there was like basically a bunch of people kind of behind the scenes trying to pass these before COVID, but what COVID is doing is it's just making it harder for the groups that want to block these changes from being able to do that.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah, for your interesting presentation and topic. For your current focus is more on developed country and with security issues. But I would like to look at another aspect because your research is only in early stage. So it is developing country. It is more visual and actual issue that they are usually at the disadvantaged position to deal with FDI companies because they are more powerful and they are more skillful, and high temptation to have FDIs makes many countries to lower their requirement to attract the investment, while their enforcement capacity and competency to deal with important issues like environmental tax avoidance are weak. So how to deal with the issue for developing country? Do you have any idea about that?
Yeah, so the reason why we focus on developed countries for this particular part of the project is because we do see that developed countries are in a position where they can do more in terms of screening investment, but also because because they're wealthier and so they can reject investment, right? But also because developed countries have more of the kind of high tech type investment that is also kind of this new wave of transactions that are kind of concerning for national security, right? Whereas developing countries, to the extent that they have national security concerns associated with FDI, that's most likely going to be in the infrastructure sectors. And for a lot of developing countries, they just want the infrastructure to be developed, and they're not really at a point where they are as worried about who owns that infrastructure, because if you're going to choose between having infrastructure that a problematic investor owns or having no infrastructure, you're probably going to choose having the infrastructure, even if it's problematic, than having none. But in terms of like the broader question about like, well, how can developing countries deal with this kind of with the issue that foreign investors have a lot of leverage over them? This is a really big topic, and one that I've written on in some respects. And I think that what is likely necessary is some level of multilateral engagement over this. And so what will be very interesting to see in the post-COVID period is how that looks, because FDI has declined like 40%, right? And so what we see is in developed countries, a lot more focus on security and FDI, and probably in developing countries, there's going to be a lot more focus on just getting investment in order to fund recovery. And so it will be interesting to see how these issues of environmental, social welfare kind of get integrated into that. But I would imagine that if you're going to see any kind of movement towards higher standards, it will be because of multinational cooperation over that, and also to some extent developed countries kind of requiring higher standards through their treaty structures and through also just kind of norms and private governance. So we'll see.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your question.
Hi, Sarah. So my question is almost exactly the same as Du's question. I also wanted to see what your take is on developing countries, reaction or response to the FDIs. And you mentioned that in developing countries, one issue is that they just want more FDIs. In fact, in many of these countries, it's more than that. China, for example, if China or other countries, they look at this from their industrial policy plans, that they have industrial policies that require different type of FDIs. And in many cases, foreign FDIs are restricted, or they put a lot of conditions on them that, for example, you need to have a joint venture with domestic entities. And as Du mentioned, actually, one of the problems that are cited often in China and some other countries, some other developing countries, is that the foreign investors and domestic actors, they are not on the same, on a level playing field, basically. And that's why the government needs to intervene to make sure that domestic actors are able to negotiate good deals with foreign investors. And as you probably know better than me about China, for example, that in different industries they have very different rules about what kind of deals can be made with foreigners. So yeah, so when you look at this issue from the perspective of European countries, maybe national security is the most important issue, but from the perspective of developing countries, there are industrial policy strategies that they have in mind, and that might be more important. So I just want to know if you are planning to look at that as well.
Yeah, so right now, I think that right now for this particular project, my first project on FDI policy focused a lot more on developing countries because they were kind of late liberalizers, and so they were a lot of the variation in my sample in terms of like when are developing countries going to liberalize. And for me, what I focused on is how the domestic financing environment really influences whether domestic firms view FDI primarily as a threat or as an opportunity. And so from that perspective, one of the reasons why China can continue to be quite close to FDI and have a lot of restrictions is because they are able to use the state control over the banking sector to direct subsidized credit to domestic firms for their industrial policy kind of reasons, and also because certain firms are particularly well connected to the government, either through state control or through kind of informal ties. When it comes to kind of the broader question of like how to think about developing countries' kind of preferences towards FDI kind of moving forward, I think for this project, we're probably going to stick just to thinking specifically about investment screening and where, and we want to focus on OECD countries for at least right now, because we think for the most part, developing countries don't have, for a bunch of different reasons, don't have the capacity to kind of do this sort of screening. China is different because China's like in a weird category. It's sort of sui generis, but China also has a much different kind of political, domestic political structure that is underlining kind of why they're choosing what they're choosing. And so we just don't think that kind of including China in this analysis is going to be a good idea. We think that would be pooling together really different cases. But there are really interesting examples like India. India is engaged in a lot more screening, likely because their neighbor is China and they're worried about that, but also because India has a much bigger tech sector than a lot of other developing countries do. So, it's going to vary country to country. And we're certainly not saying that investment screening for national security purposes is the only game in town when it comes to investment regulation, and especially not in developing countries. But we just think that the investment screening is really focused right now on these more developed economies. And so we want to focus there first before kind of expanding outward.
So we are officially out of time, or about to be out of time, but that doesn't have to end the discussion. But for those of you who need to leave, I do want to be sure to thank Sarah. I found this paper really informative, and I know you apologized several times for not having the data. I think I trust you on what you think the data is going to lead to and what the data already says. I found the paper very engaging, and obviously I'm not alone in this discussion. So I am going to hang out. Actually, I guess we're both going to hang out for another, I'm going to say 28 minutes. But for those of you who need to leave, thank you for being here. Don't forget, next week, and of course Wednesday, we have our usual research series that we always encourage you to log into as well. Link can be found at the workshop.
Thank you all. And I'm here to continue to talk, but thank you all for being here.